Good afternoon and welcome everyone. We're so grateful to have you all here joining us for this afternoon's Powering Inclusion Forum focused on our undeterred anti-racist solutions in leadership in an emboldened era as we're focused on emboldened racism in our communities. I'm Tawanna A. I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion and could not be happier to have so many of you joining us for today's conversation. I hope that today is not your first time here with us, but if it is, welcome into our Powering Inclusion Forum. And hopefully you brought some friends with you for today's conversation. It promises to be one of our most lively and enjoyable conversations because we truly have some dynamic speakers who have joined with us on today. At this time, I'd like to be able to take an opportunity to tell you just a little bit about what you can expect to have. At our Powering Inclusion Forums, we enjoy the opportunity to convene employers, policymakers, racial and economic justice leaders from across not only Minnesota, but across the country for robust conversations about the actions that are necessary for all of us to be taking in order to undo systemic racism inside our organizations and our communities and begin to accelerate inclusive economic growth and justice in our communities. The actions that are necessary in a day like today, when racism is emboldened, not only in our communities, but also in our justice systems, our education systems, our businesses, and even our schools, is critical. And today's leaders that we've gathered for our conversation are doing the hard and important work of changing those systems. And importantly, not just changing and adapting on the edges, but breaking down those systems meant to hold back Black and Brown people and creating brand new systems built to embody anti-racism, built to embody belonging, equity, and inclusion. And they're making sure that all of us are a part of creating those systems. I'm excited about today's conversation, excited to be able to bring you the tools and knowledge of the Center for Economic Inclusion that you can begin to power inside your own organizations in order to fuel inclusive economic growth. Let's jump right into it. As always, when we have these conversations, we've got a few housekeeping and introductory opportunities and tools for you to get started. So let's jump right into those. First, we want to take just a couple of opportunities to be able to share a little bit about the social media tools that we want you to be able to share with folks as we go through today's conversation. We want you to share this with people because this is important for us to share this news. Just as hate, unfortunately, becomes contagious and is shared, we must make sure that equity and inclusion and the tools for equity and inclusion are spread and are contagious as well. So be sure that you're sharing the takeaways, the aha moments, the tools that you get on today on social media. On your screen right now, you see our hashtag Powering Inclusion. You see our tag at Econ Inclusion, and many others that we'll share as well. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and yes, Instagram as well. And we want you to also tag our speakers, myself at Tawanna A Black, and our speakers as well. Be sure that you're tagging those folks in as well and taking advantage of the opportunity to bring other folks into this conversation. If you have a reaction as well, hit us up with your reaction, hit us up with questions and ahas, not only today, but in the days and weeks to come as well. We want to keep this conversation going. We also want to be sure that we're thanking our sponsors. Many wonderful companies and foundations invest in the work of the Center for Economic Inclusion, and we cannot do this work without these sponsors and partners. So a big thank you to Bremer Bank on today, who's invested in the Center for Economic Inclusion. And more than just investing dollars, Bremer Bank is doing this work with us, being front and center and changing the policies and practices and beliefs and cultures and knowledge and power systems that are at play and being sure that we're building racially equitable and inclusive organizations and communities. And we're really grateful for the work they're doing, as well as Minnesota Public Radio, Finance and Commerce, and Minnesota Lawyer, and all of the many important investors and partners who continue to invest in the work that we're doing here at the Center for Economic Inclusion. We say a big thank you to these partners and investors in our work and celebrate them and encourage you to continue doing business with these partners and sponsors as well. We want to take a moment to get to know who's in the room with us on today. We want to be sure that we're speaking to you, to the hearts and minds that are in this room, and that you're also talking to each other, because this isn't just about sharing information. It's also about building a network of community, a community of people who are doing great work. So on your screens right now, you've got a poll question, I think, that's coming up, that's going to give you a chance to be able to share a little bit about who you are and help us get to know who's in the room. We use this information not only in getting to know it in the immediate sense, but also in helping us be sure that as we follow back up with you in the days and weeks to come and years to come, that we're staying in touch and we're representing the populations who are most at the heart of the work, but also that the sectors who are doing transformational work in anti-racism and in changing our economy are at the heart of our work at the Center for Economic Inclusion. So as those questions come back up, hopefully they'll come up here. If it's not up for you, then it may come up here in just a moment. Then we invite you to be able to answer those questions and give us some feedback in order to take advantage of those. So I think we've got a question up right now that's asking us a couple questions. So you can take those polls and give us some insight about your demographic information, and that'll give us then a response here in just a moment. We'll give you a few moments to be able to respond to that. Then we'll take advantage of some intel about who is in the room. I feel like a Jeopardy host as we wait for those responses to come in each time we have this conversation. Awesome. So now we've got our results, and we can see that we've got a racially diverse room to some extent in the room today. Okay, our racial diversity is about 42% African American in the room today, 3% Indigenous, American Indian or Alaskan Native. We've got a 13% Asian population in the room, and a 48% white or Caucasian population, and a 3% biracial population, and a 10% Middle Eastern or North African population. For our age diversity today, we have a 3% 21 to 29, a 19% 30 to 39, a 39% 40 to 49, that looks like our largest population, 26% 50 to 59, and 13% 60 to 69. And in our gender identity, we have 81% female and 16% male population, and 3% gender nonconforming or gender variant. And we have in our experience of people who have been experiencing our various events, how frequently you've been engaging with us, we have a lot of newcomers. I love to see that each time we have one of our events. So 35% of you, this is your very first time participating in a center event. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It will not be your last, I promise you that, but welcome into the space. For almost 40% of you, you've been in 1 to 3 events with the center, or 1 to 3 of our programs. So welcome back to those of you who it might just be your second time. We're thrilled that you're back for another engagement with us. For 10% of you, you've participated in 4 to 6 experiences with us. And so we know that those of you are really building on your knowledge, you're applying that knowledge and really taking advantage of many different experiences. And we've got a number of folks, this is amazing, a number of folks who are really killing it. They are out there leading the pack, and we are going to be really counting on their questions and responses as we get to the end of today's program, because we've got 13% of people in the room who have participated in more than 6 of our programs and engagements. So shout out to you all. We love our legacy builders because they are really out there leading and transforming their organizations and applying their knowledge. So we love to see that as well. And our last question, and this is really important to us, is how are you using what you gain? When we launched this organization just about 6 years ago, one of the biggest questions that we asked the field was, what do you need? What are you doing today inside your organizations? And what do you need from an organization like the Center for Economic Inclusion? And one of the things that we heard really early on was that lots of people had a lot of DEI training that wasn't working on their racial equity and inclusion results. And so people said, we want you to distinguish between the two. We need some more education, but we know that we can't just ask for more training. We need it to be applied education and applied data. So we always ask this question about what are you doing with the education that we offer? So today we've asked the question for those of you who have been to more than one of our convenings or educations or experiences, what are you doing? And so we see here that 32% of you have developed new relationships. You're using the connections that you've made here and you're turning those into more opportunities to meet with folks and really nurture those relationships with us, which is significant in terms of how we develop trust that we can build on for solidarity and transformation. We also see that 26% of you, this is excellent, have developed new policies, practices, or strategies inside your organizations in the workforce area. This is excellent because we know we have great strides to make in our communities that are going to transform our talent, our leadership, and our retention. We see that 13% of you have developed new strategies or policies or practices in supplier diversity, which is something we're really going to hit on today. So we're thrilled to see that that number is 13%, but we know we've got great opportunities, so you're in the right place on today. 10% of you who have participated in a program before have developed something in the philanthropy place, 10% in the marketplace, and 10% in the economic development, workforce, or other arenas for policy, practice, and strategy. And 58% said, I've got some work to do. I've participated maybe, but I haven't quite been able to apply that. So that 58%, you're in the right room because we've got a team of folks in this space who are participating as well from the Center for Economic Inclusion, and we are ready to help you. So we're glad that you're here. We're glad that you want to take action on the data that you're gathering here with us at the center, and we are going to help you put that knowledge to work. So thanks for being here and taking advantage of this opportunity. So let's be sure that we dig in to this content on today. We've got a robust program, as I said. Today, we are talking about how we take data-informed action in this era of emboldened racism. I know because you're here on today, even if you're just listening to this after today's program on our YouTube channel, that you've heard there are many lawsuits that are being filed, setbacks that we're experiencing in affirmative action, in our business development arena with SBA 8A experiencing significant setbacks, with the Fearless Fund nationally experiencing setbacks, locally having many of us fearing for litigation against our programs that have been designed in order to help advance equity, but more than that, in order to address the wealth extraction that has occurred in our Indigenous communities, our African American communities, and additional communities of color year after year, decade after decade, century after century. Programs that have begun making incremental progress but haven't even begun to scratch the surface of transformation are now being attacked legally. Litigation is causing us to take our eyes off the prize in order to fight cases that can't continue. So today's conversation is not just to talk about that litigation, but to talk about what actions employers who are committed to racial equity, inclusion, and belonging, committed to ensuring that these initiatives truly do begin to result in building wealth equity, what actions employers and policymakers can take, must take in solidarity with Black and Brown workers and businesses in order to ensure that our economy truly does become that place that works for everyone. How we can use data in order to stimulate an inclusive regional economy, how we acknowledge our history as a country, how we acknowledge our history here in Minnesota, how communities reckon with data and storytelling in order to truly reckon with the past and build a future that is truly prosperous, and how we measure that future, why it's important for employers, academia, and small businesses. We're going to talk about all of this and more with some amazing panelists. But first, we want to start by starting to understand our history. We've got an amazing opportunity to be able to reflect on that history. And one of my amazing colleagues here at the Center for Economic Inclusion has taken an opportunity to give you an opportunity to see a tool that we use with our consulting clients to understand America's history. We believe it's critical for us to understand the way that economics have been seated in our history, from the very earliest of days to today, how policy has been used to drive racism, and how we must be just as intentional with policy in every sector in order to build a future that is intentionally racially equitable and inclusive. I introduce to you now Tiffany Wilson, who will walk us through our history.
Hello, my name is Tiffany Wilson-Worsley, and I am the Director of Employee Learning and Engagement at the Center for Economic Inclusion. Today, I will provide an overview of how throughout history, systemic racism has created our current racial wealth gap. This knowledge is essential for us to build a racially inclusive and equitable regional economy, one that works for everyone. Racial inequity today is sustained by overtly racist talk or action, and those certainly exist and should continue to alarm us. But today, I invite you to unpack the racial inequities that have come to sustained by their own momentum, because they are baked into our belief systems, into the places, policies, and practices that shape our daily lives. Today, we introduce the 500-year wealth gap. This timeline was created by Living Cities to create a common understanding of the historical economic exclusion practices designed to exclude the Black community. While this timeline focuses on the history of slavery and reparations for African Americans, a parallel timeline could exist to highlight institutionalized and systemic oppression toward Native Americans in attempts for reparation. So as you hear and follow the history, the key dates and events, I want you to remember that all this happened and continues to happen on stolen land. Now let's look at a timeline. I'll highlight some key dates here. 1619, the first ship carrying highly skilled, enslaved Africans. They then land here at the English colony of Virginia. Then in 1860, we see a surge of wealth created. Cotton grown and picked by these enslaved African workers was known to be the nation's most valuable export. According to Matthew Desmond of the 1619 Project, slavery was undeniably a font of phenomenal wealth. Another key date, 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. At this point, formerly enslaved Africans were now freed. However, there was no intentional way forward to build wealth. There was no capital given. Thus, wealth building was out of reach. By 1870s, a decade after the 13th Amendment, Black wealth nationally was near zero. 99.95% of the nation's wealth was owned by white Americans, and 0.05% of the nation's wealth owned by Black Americans. 1900, whites were allowed to take advantages of several wealth-creating and social mobility opportunities, such as free land, access to capital, and home ownership subsidies, from which people of color were legally excluded. Again, in the 1900s, we saw that 46% of white Americans owned a home versus 22% of Black Americans. Properties across the country had racial covenants prohibiting the sales to Black people. By 1944, the GI Bill was passed, offering college tuition, low-cost home loans, and unemployment insurance to veterans. However, the implementation of such reward made the benefits inaccessible for the majority of Black veterans. No greater instrument of widening an already huge gap in post-war America than the GI Bill. By 1983, the median Black wealth was $13,000, and 105,000 was the median wealth for white Americans. We see here by 1998, the wealth gap widens. Today, the wealth gap continues to widen. I highlighted a few historical events that created and widened the wealth gap. Now I want you to think about the wealth gap and how it shows up today. As we think about different data points and different opportunities by which we see this, I want you to think about how this shows up in your organizations, how it shows up within your leadership. When you think about home ownership rates, when you think about asset income, when you're looking at an organization and their leadership team, when we look at wage and promotions, who's more likely to get promoted? These are still places where we still see contributions to widening and maintaining the intentionally created wealth gap that exists today. I want to leave you with this. Change requires conscious interruption of the status quo. That to embrace racial equity in our organizations, we have to acknowledge the history and the impact of racism on today's wealth gap. We also must hold an honest narrative of what truly happened, how we got here. And then we also must then examine the current systems that are holding the systemic problem in place. Only then can we continue to create systems that institutionalize racial equity, to build a racially inclusive and equitable regional economy, one that works for everyone, where race does not determine one's outcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I hope that as you took in that 500-year journey, you gained new facts, new information, and new insight. I hope that you sat not only with the facts and the journey, but you started to sit with the stories and the experiences of families. Families you might have heard about or seen before, but families who you hadn't thought about were impacted not just by their own experiences, their own choices, the choices of families who came before them, but by the choices of people in power. People who had power to make decisions that were different than the decisions they actually made. People in power in seats of policy, people in power inside companies like the companies you might work in today. People in power in jobs like the jobs you and I sit in today. Maybe you started to think about the power that you hold. I hope you did. Our jobs are to think about the power that we hold and how we'll use that power to create different change that can impact generations, not just to come, but the generations even of today. I want us to start to think about a little bit of data before we go into our conversation with our panelists on today. Today, we're motivated by the changes that are occurring. I mentioned earlier some of the litigation. More than 2 years ago, we started to reckon with what was happening in our own community, seeing businesses who were trying to thrive, but reckoning with the challenges to thrive. And we started digging into the data that was keeping businesses and telling a story about business prosperity or business constraint. I want to show you now just a little bit of that data in case you haven't been on that journey with us. We recognize that while businesses were competing for opportunity and economic growth, often businesses are constrained in their opportunity to be able to move forward. If our team could put those slides up now, we'd have an opportunity to think about some of the family wealth and the opportunity to think through where businesses and opportunities constrict and often conflict with whether or not median wealth is growing in our communities, as you see on the slide here. We have opportunities to think about how families move forward in our communities and whether or not wealth is actually equitably distributed. Next slide, please. We also see that while wealth is an important factor for us, we see that business ownership contributes to the ability to be able to drive wealth. In fact, as you see on the screen here, white business owners have 3 times the wealth of their Black counterparts. Why is this important? Because as we've seen in recent weeks, the attack on Black business ownership and Latina women business ownership and other business owners of color is not simply about whether or not those business owners receive opportunities for extra dollars to grow their businesses. It's actually an attack on the wealth building opportunities. Why is that important? Because of that journey over the last 500 years that you just heard my colleague talk about. Those policies that were put in place to strip wealth have not only left us in a place where wealth is needed in order to grow our businesses, but where wealth is needed in order to create jobs that allow families to prosper in our economy. It also, as we look at our next opportunity, is a chance for us to think about what challenges are in place in accessing credit and opportunities to grow our businesses. You might think, well, this is common knowledge, Tawanna. Why is it important? Well, it's important because not only do Black and brown-owned businesses suffer more challenges in accessing credit day to day, but also when we norm for their credit scores and we norm for the types of credit that business owners are seeking, we also see that the barriers to access that credit still persist. What does that mean? It means that banks have not, even when we've accounted for the laws changing, begun to see business owners as equal, begun to see the types of opportunity that those businesses are pursuing as equal, such that when I walk in and a business owner walks in with the same type of business, that our lenders are seeing us as just as equal in our opportunity to create jobs, in our opportunity to have an impact on the business and the economy, such that they're willing to make investments in our economy by investing in us as businesses. And that is why accelerators like ours, accelerators and other CDFIs like those that we have in our community, and like the Fearless Fund and others, need to exist. They're not existing simply because our banking system is working. They're existing because we still have barriers within that system that call out the need for distinct and targeted programs in order to cultivate inclusive economic growth. And lastly, we have an opportunity to start to think critically about what it would do if we were to address the gaps in the approval rates, making sure that, again, when we solve for credit and credit history, we're starting to see these credit rates and approval rates start to improve. Lastly, when we think about what it would do if we were to close the gap in the businesses in our community, this wouldn't simply be about the number of businesses we might see in our commercial corridors, but ultimately it gets to the number of new jobs that would be created in our communities. Many of the corporations who made great pledges after George Floyd's murder about spending dollars in Black and brown communities did not do so simply because our communities were hurting, but did so because they recognized the need to see our economy grow, the need to create jobs that pay family-sustaining wages, that would see our economy continue to churn and make sure that America's economy is healthy for many generations to come. If just 15% of Black-owned businesses had employment parity with their white-owned peers, it would create more than 600,000 new jobs in our economy. That is good for everyone in our marketplace. But let's boil that down to Minnesota. If you were to go to our website at the Center for Economic Inclusion.org, you'd find an opportunity to go to our research tab and see our indicators for inclusive regional economy. I'd like to highlight a little bit of that data that's available there for you now on our next slide. When you look there, you're able to understand a little bit about indicators that we created several years ago and continue to refresh so that leaders can understand what's happening in our marketplace and how various indicators of economic growth, inclusion, and belonging make up an economy and either make it inclusive or exclusive. More than that, you start to understand by looking at these indicators what you and I can do in order to make the economy stronger and healthier for everyone. I want to highlight just a couple of indicators so that you understand on a local level, if you live here in Minnesota, what you can do. And if you don't live here in Minnesota and you're thinking, how do I get these indicators for my community? How you can call us in order to do just that. We highlight here just a couple of the business indicators on the site. The value of bank loans to small businesses. When we look here at these indicators, we see that 13.8% of Minneapolis-St. Paul's majority Black and brown neighborhoods are receiving only 6% of bank loans to businesses. That's a comparative number. While majority white neighborhoods only represent 86% of the neighborhoods, they're receiving 94% of bank loans. What does this mean? Well, think about the neighborhood that you live in. Think about the demographics of that neighborhood. How many banks are in that neighborhood? How accessible is your neighborhood bank? Do they know you when you walk in to conduct business? More than that, do you know them? Do you feel confident walking in to conduct business? Or do you feel a little trepidation about walking in? Do you trust that bank? Do you have a bank account? Everyone doesn't. Everyone doesn't trust the place where they keep their money and have their direct deposits. Everyone doesn't have direct deposit. We want to make sure that we're investing in communities equitably, that we have access to banking and banking tools equitably, so that we can stimulate inclusive economic growth. On this next slide, we have an opportunity to think even more critically about how we ensure that our business ownership is growing, in particular when we think about our Black and Latin-owned businesses and their growth over the last decade. While we've seen that growth continue to move up, particularly here in Minnesota, but nationally as well, we still see dips in ownership. If we were to see that ownership get on par nationally, in particular with employer-owned businesses, meaning those businesses that have more than one employee, the opportunity to see those businesses compete for contracts, particularly with large corporations in a market like Minnesota, where we have so many headquarter businesses, the opportunity for them to create jobs, economic growth, and sustainability would multiply and have an impact for all of us. And lastly, as we start to think about the capital that is flowing in our economy on this next slide, we want to think about the solutions that you can deploy. I won't call out each one of these, but if you look on our site, you'll also see a report we issued just last year from our Vanguard Accelerator, offering employers a number of different solutions that you can think about in your supply chain. Often, we're all at different points on a continuum. Maybe you've got an advanced supplier diversity initiative. You're already making progress and you're pretty proud of your spend, but you haven't started to disaggregate it at a local level and by analyzing race and ethnic diversity. That may be your opportunity. Perhaps you haven't even begun to measure supplier diversity, so your opportunity is to create a system where you're actually disaggregating your data and setting measurable goals. Maybe you have a program, but you haven't been able to bring in suppliers in all of your areas, or you have an opportunity to start to debundle your contracts so that people can compete for some that are pretty significant and have caused you to only go with very large national suppliers. All of us have some opportunity, including small organizations like my own. It starts with a commitment to ensuring that we're committed to diversifying our supply chains, a commitment to living our values out every day. While this is only one part of our conversation today, we felt like it was critical to start with the information before digging deeper into our conversation. And now I'd like to welcome our panelists into this conversation that's so critically important. We've got a power-packed house on today. I'm sad to say that one of our panelists is ill and will not be able to join us. Khadija Ali desperately wanted to be with us, but is ill, so let's please keep her lifted up. But we have a power-packed house with us, so we want to invite you to please, if you haven't already read their bios, please check out their bios out on our website because they are each phenomenal in their own right. But I want to welcome each one of them into the room at this time. Thomas Harris Jr. from Gillette Children's, Dr. Angela Springer, from the University of Minnesota and the Carlson School, and Amram Farah, from Green Espel. Welcome to each one of you from being in with us. I'm thrilled that you could each be here with me on today. We had a wonderful conversation in prepping for today's conversation, and I can't wait to be able to dig in even deeper into the conversation and welcome our audience to each one of you to get to know you all just a little bit better. As you come into the room, I'm going to invite you all to share just a little bit about yourself and what this topic, as we're wrestling with how we confront racism in an emboldened era of racism and policy, what it means to you personally and to your institutions. And I'll start with you, Dr. Springer.
Thank you so much, Tawanna. Can you hear me okay? Great. And thank you to Tawanna and the whole CEI team for your excellent work in this region and in this space. It's my honor to be included in this conversation. And your leadership matters. I was very grateful to get to work with the Vanguard Accelerator earlier this year. You are making an impact on this generation, and I wanted to make sure to say that first off. I am coming to you from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, built on the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. And while it's important to do land acknowledgements and recognize the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work, I want to make sure that the University of Minnesota is very clear that we recognize that words are not enough. We are working to ensure that our institution does provide support, resources, and programs that will increase access to all aspects of higher education for our students, staff, faculty, and community members from the 778 tribes that are represented in Minnesota, from the Mille Lacs Band to the Chippewa Band, from White Earth to Red Lake and Choctaw and Cherokee, and so many more. I wanted to make sure to say that first. I bring to this work the work of inclusion, as I have on my LinkedIn profile, because I believe that diversity is the facts. Diversity is the numbers and the details and the data and the demographics. But the work is inclusion that will get us to equity, which is the goal. And I bring a lived experience as a Black woman, well over 40, so a Gen Xer, raised and trained. And this is just my truth. Somebody else out there might have the same truth. Feel free to give me a shout out if you can relate. But I was raised and trained in environments where tone policing, the need to be twice as good, and I'm not even gonna finish that sentence, respectability politics reigned. I had to learn how to function in those spaces where there were people in my family who had mobility and vision challenges and impairments, and they had to contend with systems and workplaces that did not accommodate them. So it was always a matter of trying to find out and figure out how to survive, not thrive, not find economic empowerment, but just survive. And that's what I came from. And now I get to bring the joy and the privilege of getting to encourage people into the space of inclusive excellence, the journey toward inclusive excellence, acknowledging that yes, your organization, our organization, our school may very well have a reputation for excellence, but has it been inclusive? How can we improve access and success for our historically marginalized and minoritized groups? How can we ensure that the climate and relations in our organization is conducive to people feeling like they belong, they own, and they can cherish this organization? What are we platforming? How are we educating and training our employees, our students, right? What does our infrastructure look like? Are we actually putting walk behind our talk? And finally, what does our community engagement look like? Are we representing ourselves as an anchor of equity in the community? That's my platform, that's my program, my strategic framework. And so that's what I get to bring to this conversation and to this experience. And I'm relating to the idea of undeterred anti-racism and anti-racist leadership, because it is heartbreaking. It has been heartbreaking over the last few years for people my age and younger to experience, but also for our elders to relive the emboldened racism in this country. So I'm honored again. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much. I really resonate with that undeterred leadership in this era. Thomas, I'm going to come over to you and ask the same question.
Sure. So I am Thomas Harrison. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Gillette Children's, and I've been in Minnesota for 2 years. And so in that 2 years, got a chance to become affiliated with the Center for Economic Inclusion, and am truly a fan of the work that is being done there. So to answer your question more directly, first, the reason why I was really drawn to this forum and wanted to participate as a panel is, first and foremost, I am an African-American parent and a father. And so I have a 10th grader, which in 3 years, she will be gracing the halls of someone's university. And so last night, actually, as I was preparing for this forum, I was talking to her and talking through with her the repercussions of what the Supreme Court actually did and what that meant for her, and how affirmative action actually came about and why it was put in place at institutions like Harvard and University of North Carolina. And if you go back to the 1960s and then look at the Harvard statistics, their freshman class at that point was about 1,200 students. And before they put the affirmative action clause in place, they had probably 7% of that 1,200 that were African Americans. And shortly after putting it in place, it doubled within a year and went up to almost 14%. And so, I was using that as an example to her of, this is what this means. And so this just means now that we have to fight a little bit harder to make sure that you have a seat at the table, meaning in college. We have to fight that much harder to make sure that you are seen as a viable applicant in order to get a good education in this country. They have, in my opinion, removed some of the stepping stones that we've been using to get us to the point where we have equity, not just equality, but equity. So that's the first thing. The second is being a representative of Gillette Children's and being a senior executive there. We have to have a workforce that represents the demographic of patients that we actually take care of. And so, it's very important to us that we're able to have a diverse pool of candidates to actually pull from. And so therefore, we have to make sure that, especially for certain jobs that require degrees or advanced degrees or what have you, that we have the candidate pool. And so if that candidate pool is not going to a 4-year college or university because they now either can't afford it or because they're not seen as a viable candidate, then it lessens the pool that I have and we have to draw from in order to bring it to our doors. And so from an employer standpoint, and from a father and a parent standpoint, I'm very passionate about this. And so that is the reason why I was pulled into, participating in this forum, because we have to continue to fight. We have to be intentional. We have to be bold. If I go back to what Tiffany said, she says, change requires conscious interruption. And so we have to be disruptive. We have to interrupt. We can't just sit back and say, okay, then we have to take all of the strategies and the tactics that we've tried to put in place over the last several years off the table because of this ruling. There are still things that we can do in order to keep fighting and to keep making sure that we are diversifying our workplace, because we know when we do, that there is a gain in knowledge, there's a gain in innovation, there's a gain in the overall growth of your organization. And so again, I won't belabor the point. That is why I'm passionate about this. That is why I'm, pulling up and having a seat at this table. And that is why, as an organization and as organizations and as professionals, we have to keep pushing the envelope on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thanks so much for that, Thomas. I absolutely appreciate the multi-generational answer there, and that you brought her into this conversation in preparing for this, but also that she is in the room as a result of bringing that response into that. I so appreciate that answer as well. And lastly, but certainly not least, here, it was so important to us to have the perspective of legal authority in this conversation, but also one who is working with small businesses and non-small businesses owned by our communities each and every day. So welcome into the room, Ron. I appreciate you being here. And same question.
Thank you. I'm the person that forgot to mute. There's usually one person in every meeting. Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here. It's great. It's been a while since I've been in a room of people talking about these comments. Usually the room I'm in, I'm talking people off the cliff of saying, you know, you can do this. And so for me, you know, I'm a partner at a litigation firm. Most of 85% of what I do is commercial litigation representing Fortune 50 companies. So very, very big companies. And so a lot of what we're doing is really looking at litigation and looking at risk and deciding whether or not there's a business case for bringing a claim. And then if, you know, if we're defending, trying to figure out the story for our company. So a lot of it is not necessarily good work, but it's, you know, work that is needed. Now, when I've been an attorney for 10 years, and I'm kind of at the beginning of my career shied away from the DEI work. I didn't want to be the Black attorney with the scarf who was doing the DEI work. I wanted to be the good litigator. I wanted to be the good trial attorney, and I only wanted that to speak with me. But then I was in a lot of rooms where people were saying things that I just couldn't hold my tongue back. I actually remember early in my career, I was in a room where a client dropped the N-word, and I was just like, how is this okay in this world? And so, you know, as I've gotten older in my career, I've really tried to, a lot of it, not even in the billable side, of just letting clients know decisions aren't necessarily all based on just litigation risk. There is reputational risk. And I think even having the conversations now after the Supreme Court case, I think, you know, a lot of companies are understanding we made these commitments, you know, after the murder of George Floyd, you know, we said these things, and now we kind of have to stand behind them. And so what I believe my role is, in the, you know, the best thing I could do is embolden companies who really care about DEI being able to do that in a way that lessens their reputational risk, that emboldens their, you know, DEI folks and people in their C-suite who care and want to keep these programs, who want to do more, be able to do that without being afraid that someone's going to sue them. And not only that they sue them, but they'll be the case that gets to the Supreme Court. Because that's what companies, especially in the size of companies that I work with, that's what they're afraid of. They know that there are, you know, people and organizations sitting there waiting for a case that they could take to, you know, the 8th Circuit, the 9th Circuit, and ultimately to a Supreme Court that's going to give them good precedent. So what's important now, and the work that I love doing right now, is helping companies kind of rethink it. Don't change anything. I think I say it like 10 times in every call, is you don't have to change anything. The law hasn't really changed, but the litigation risk has changed. And so let's talk about what you can do while you stay committed to, you know, the commitments that you made to your community, to your consumers, to your shareholders, while you can still do that without necessarily being the next case on Bloomberg or Law 360, because that's what they don't want. That's what their litigators and general counsels, that's what they're afraid of. And so, you know, it took me a while to get to a point where I didn't necessarily just want to be the token Black attorney or token Muslim attorney or token immigrant attorney, whatever they want to use, and really be, you know, a partner with my clients in doing something that will make a difference in the long run. Because a lot of clients us right after the Supreme Court case were afraid and were saying, should we stop these programs? You know, we had these fellowships, these internships, you know, should we pull all of this funding? Can we still give to this, you know, to this organization? And it's really working with them and making them feel comfortable that they can stick with their commitments without, you know, and lessen their litigation risk and doing it. And so that's kind of what I've been spending, you know, my time when I'm not, you know, just defending companies just because they pay me to.
Absolutely. I love that that's the point that you are in this introduction on, because I think that's exactly where we are, right? It's this tense balance between what's the right thing to do, right? We don't, in our work at the center, we have this balance between, we've come really hard out for the last 6 years on the economic case. The economic case, the dollars and cents are there. There's a clear case. There's a 1-for-1 return on companies who invest strategically on gender and racial equity inside their businesses. You get the dollars back 1-for-1. There are other people who say, well, it shouldn't be the dollars and cents. You should be invested in this because it's the right thing. And yet we know America has not stayed in any of this type of work for very long because it's the right thing to do. And now with this litigation risk, I would say for our clients about 50-50. 50% are saying we're not going to change anything. 50% are saying we're not leaving the work, but we do need to massage the language a bit to avoid being a target in our materials, right? We don't want to be distracted from the work by suddenly being in a lawsuit. I think we heard in academia similarly, where there's less choice, right? There's some need to be able to adapt, at least legally, the language, even if we're not getting out of the work. I want to start with you, Dr. Springer, because academia maybe started this, I guess, with affirmative action. And then we saw this flow out. And because we know corporations, employers, all of us, we need the talent desperately that's coming out of our higher education system in order to ensure that we're continuing to fuel innovation inside of our organizations. What are you experiencing right now in higher education following the ruling on affirmative action? Do students understand what the ruling is? Do parents understand it? Do faculty? And what's your response been? And what do you see happening in not just the today future, right, the immediate knee jerk, but in the next 5 years?
That's everything, Tawanna. First of all, I want to say hey to my colleague, Thomas, because I didn't realize you were new to the area like me. So, you know, new Minnesotans unite. Second, I want to say this is why we all need to vote, because we saw this coming a few years ago. And we definitely saw it start, right, with the Supreme Court's momentous decision last summer. Not this summer, last summer, the one that really sort of rocked us all with regard to women's reproductive rights. We saw this in process. So it's important for us to all vote, and vote with as much information as possible. And that's as political as I'm going to get. With regard to the affirmative action decision this year, and I'll just go ahead and qualify that I used to teach human resource management and define affirmative action for my students. I'm gonna let my sister Amron define it better when we come back around her, but I used to say that affirmative action is the intentional effort to remedy the present effects of past discrimination. Now, 5-10 years ago, when I was teaching in the classroom, I could definitively state that and say that is the definition and that's what we're going with. And I would get some pushback from some students who, you know, maybe had come into the class. They would be seniors and they'd have some perceptions that they were bringing into the class with them. But we could get through that. Now, can you imagine? Can you already see the bombastic, grandstanding politician who would shout me down and try to whip up outrage among people, you know, try to play to people's fears about the possibility that affirmative action is about taking something away, right, from one person to give it to an undeserving other. And that's what I think we're seeing play out, is the battle between fear and curiosity. And unfortunately, right in through here, fear has been winning out in this country because what we're seeing is an insidious underlying assumption that person number one has an entitlement to the thing, whether it's a promotion at work or a professional development opportunity or an internship or admission to an incoming class at college. That's the thing that I like to point out, whether it's a student or faculty member or a parent. First, we need to knock down that presumption of entitlement. Then we get to look at the qualifications of the two candidates. And you can do that race blind. You can. But we don't in this country. And so the affirmative action policies, the race conscious admissions practices, has allowed there to be a little bit more opportunity for students who, like me, had to have a little bit extra of a door being opened, right? Because affirmative action allowed, the predominantly white institution that I attended to even consider me. It made, not allowed, it made them consider me. But it didn't get me a single grade. Not one class gave me a grade because I was Black or female or coming from a low-income household. I had all kinds of things, all kinds of eligibility factors there. So what we are seeing is more of a fear reaction that there will be more impact than has been so far. Right now at the University of Minnesota, definitely, we are saying very clearly, very explicitly, that we value having a diversity of views and experiences that enrich academic life, that we are, I'm going to quote our provost to make sure that I say it exactly on point. We remain steadfast in our commitment to our educational mission of inclusion and access, to remove barriers to higher education for underrepresented populations, and to ensure that all members of our community have equitable access to the university and its resources. We will continue our recruiting efforts that have yielded increased diversity in our entering classes. We remain committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice on all our campuses. And I posted that back at the end of July or June when the decision first came out, because this statement came out immediately, and I was very proud of our provost and our university for that. And somebody challenged it and said, oh, you're only committed to continuing recruiting efforts. What about graduation? And so I want to say right now that there is also a concerted effort, particularly here at the Carlson School of Management, where I'm doing the diversity leadership, that we are also concerned very much about ensuring that right along with those recruiting efforts and incoming students, we are also making sure that our students who are already here in the University of Minnesota system, right, feel empowered, feel like this is their place, have opportunities to succeed and to grow, have access to scholarships, internships, mentorships, equity. That's what we're about over here. I hope that answers the question, Tawanna. I didn't mean to start preaching.
Absolutely. It's power. I love it. I love it. Thomas, you all at Gillette Children's have been really deeply committed to always embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion, but specifically racial equity and inclusion over the last few years. And I know the importance of the pipeline is critical in the medical fields, not only at Gillette Children's, but across the field. Tell us what this has meant in your organization and what you all are doing to be sure that that pipeline stays wide open. And what do you think other employers should be considering in this era?
Yeah, well, at the institution, and I think in the industry, we're all taking notice. Now, of course, it has not hit us yet, like it has hit higher education, but we're taking notice because we know that it's probably going to be a domino effect. I mean, we're starting to see things outside of the healthcare industry that are, happening. For instance, with, lawsuits against the SBA and in other industries. So we know that it's probably coming our way. But that's where I would say Gillette and our leader and our executive leadership team and everyone down to our frontline employees, we're bold and we're being intentional, and we're going to continue to be intentional. And so, through the work of working with your organization, we've put some very good strategies in place to make sure that we are monitoring our progression on DEI initiatives. And we've also hardwired some of those metrics into the performance of our leaders. So we know that they are accountable for them and that they are driving these initiatives, and we are not taking our foot off the gas. And so we monitor and we measure how many BIPOC employees we have coming into the organization overall, as well as new hires. We also monitor the number of BIPOC employees that we have turnover within the organization. And if we see that number is declining, we're looking at what are the action plans in place in order to rectify that. We're also looking at the amount of money that we spend with minority businesses. And those are the things that we are doing that every organization should be doing, so you can make sure that these tactics, these strategies are hardwired into your organization so you can continue to push the ball forward and continue to move the dial. I know that there are some organizations out there that may not feel that they want to be as bold, and for lack of a better term, they want to continue. They want to color within the lines of the law. There are still things that those organizations could do. They could reach outside of the four walls of their organization and make sure that they're building strategic partnerships. And you can do this whether you're being bold or not being bold, but building partnerships with schools, with programs, with professional societies that cater to minority students and professionals, so that they understand and they know that you are an ally, you're a supporter of DEI, and that your organization has strategies in place that in a culture that will welcome them and that will keep them. And so again, those are things that any organization could and should be doing in order to make sure that we are continuing to move the dial on DEI, in spite of what is going on from a legal perspective.
I appreciate the last part that you hit on. I think, Dr. Springer, you hit on this too, that so often we can think like, okay, this was a long time ago, and so why do we need these programs right now? And there are so many fields that just simply have not diversified yet. And so it is not simply about a handout, but sometimes it is about a much more wide open door and needing to have some specific things in place that make sure that all, whether it's all students, all college students, all people know that, wait a minute, this door is open, and it takes more than a job posting. It takes more than saying, wait a minute, the college application it is open. It takes some intentional effort. And I think one of the things I've appreciated about Gillette and the work we've done is one of the first things you all did was ask us to come in and look at data, not only things like HR data and turnover data, but also patient data, and say, wait a minute, let's compare these two things. Mm-hmm. Let's understand what's happening with talent, what's happening with our patients, and let's then compare and be sure that our strategy is responsive to what our patients need. Let's be sure that the talent and our vendor data matches what our patients need, because it's a business after all, right? It makes sense.
Right.
It makes sense, right? There's a business piece here. Sure. Absolutely.
Those are your measurable impacts, right? And I'm in a school of business. We're all about data. And although I was a qualitative researcher when I was on faculty, but the data matter, right? The impact that I think you asked earlier about, what are the measurable impacts about what's been happening as a result of this affirmative action decision? And that's why I wanted to go straight to what the University of Minnesota statement is as of right now. Nothing has changed. And we're going to try very hard to keep things at equilibrium here, because the value of ensuring a diverse student body shows up in the makeup of the student candidates for internships at your organizations, your companies, right? It shows up in the makeup of the graduating class that you're going to hire into your companies and your organization. It shows up in their skills, the conflict management skills, because diversity at its root, at its core, is inherently conflict. It's about different ways of thinking, different ways of approaching situations, so that we do better, we make better decisions, we come through our problem solving in more unique and creative ways, because we have to learn to work with each other in unique ways, new ways. But the ugly thing is where we suffer, right, is when people who are working AI, engineers, don't have any experience, any lived experience with different color skin, different shaped faces, right? And so they build things that exclude entire groups of the population. Or when we have doctors, like you were just mentioning, who have no experience understanding, how to serve the Muslim community, how to serve Black women, how to serve Hispanic and Latin people. I mean, the diversity is only going to benefit us as we move forward as a culture and society together. And so we suffer terribly when we perpetuate the systems of racial bias in this country, when laws are drafted by lawyers who don't look anything like the folks that they're, the constituencies, when they're going into legislation. It makes sense to me.
Absolutely.
It makes
Absolutely.
sense to me. I just figured I'd put that little plug in there, for this is why we do what we do.
Yeah.
Right? Because we have
Absolutely.
to help make it make sense. That's what the young folks
Make it
say
make
now, right?
sense.
Make it make
Absolutely.
sense.
Make it make
Yeah.
sense. Absolutely. I want to touch on so much, we have the Supreme Court decision around affirmative action that took place in higher education. Following that, the SB 8A decisions have actually been started with the Minority Business Development Centers many, many months ago, maybe even a year ago. Now following the SB 8A decisions, Fearless Funds lawsuit. And these are critical things. Many people, we're familiar with the talent wars, right? We're familiar with the talent wars. The impacts on businesses, though, often are underground, right? We don't hear that. And Thomas, you hit a little bit on supplier diversity. I want to be sure we touch on this because it's so critical. We're just scraping the edges of transformation here. We're just starting to see dollars flow, and we can't afford to go backwards. It's just the simple answer. And so I want to bring you back into this conversation again. Ron, what should we be doing? Can you give us a little more facts as well here on the implications of the Fearless Fund? We had a small win. We celebrated, I think, on a Friday, and then Sunday we took 2 steps backwards again. Where are we legally right now? What are the risk organizations like our own? We've got a Vanguard Accelerator and a fund focused on Black and Latino women, Indigenous people. Where should we be concerned in our state, right? As dollars are starting to flow, what do corporations and government agencies need to be thinking about? How can they help? What should they do? And what should our business community, our small and Black and brown owned businesses, what should we be thinking about so we can continue to stay active in the supply chains of companies who have been investing? Yes, I just gave you a mega mouthful of questions.
No, it's been an active few weeks in the legal. And so, right now nothing has changed. A district court in the Northern District of Georgia made a decision, and the 11th Circuit, reversed that decision based on very narrow, specific, facts. And so, if you're all the way in Minnesota, you're watching that, but nothing has really changed for you. But from the cases that we've seen, from the litigation that has been going on in the last year, even before the affirmative action case, it's been clear that what these groups, obviously these are conservative groups that were put together basically and primarily to challenge these DEI programs. And what we're seeing is what they're going after is supplier programs, ones that are very specific and have a targeted, numerical goal. For example, a company saying that we're going to spend, 10% or 30% of our, buying power with BIPOC communities, something that they can say, okay, this is a zero-sum game. So some of the things that they've been doing more recently since the Supreme Court case has been taking things from the Chief Justice's opinion, this idea of, admissions is a zero-sum game. If I get admitted into the University of Minnesota, someone else doesn't get that option. And so this idea that it's zero-sum game. Supplier might be, if your company has, regularly spends $10 billion, if you say that you're going to spend 10% of your spend, that means that you're setting aside those dollars only for BIPOC, companies, versus what we've been telling companies is, you want to avoid anything that looks like a quota. So of saying that, we want to hire, 3% of our board needs to be women or people of color. Rather say we want to increase our board representation. Even if you want to get to a number, we want to increase board representation, in the next 5 years to this. And that way it's not zero. You're not, setting aside a board position for someone. You're not setting aside dollars for someone. So that's one area that they've really been focusing on. Anything that has a numerical that can be either seen as being a quota, that can go to this idea of it being zero-sum, that some people lose and others don't. The other idea is anything that, another line that people who are bringing these cases love from the Supreme Court decision is that, eliminating racism means eliminating all racism. And so this idea that, giving anyone a leg up, anyone a plus factor, means that it's unfortunate. So for example, in the Fearless Fund is this idea that only Black women could apply. They argue that their members are white and Asian. I'd be surprised how many are Asian, but this idea that, I can't apply because, I'm a white, it's unlikely whether or not they would ever apply. And so this idea is kind of, and I tell people, it's all so they can get to the Court of Appeals and that they could get in front of the Supreme Court. And so they have a bunch of these test cases going through, and then they're picking circuits and picking courts that they think are more likely to give them good case law. And so, now companies, again, looking at risk is to say, okay, knowing the kind of arguments we know they'll make, a claim under Section 1981 for contracting, they'll bring that claim, or they'll bring a claim for discrimination if they see that there is a policy that has a disparate impact. And, and so knowing that, what can you do to not change your program to get rid of your commitments, but what can you do to make it harder for someone to actually bring a case, still have the same commitments? Now, different companies have different risk levels, and so, I have some clients that have very little risk levels, and that, have boards and shareholders that don't necessarily want to take that risk. Other companies are a lot more likely to take that risk. And so everyone's keeping an eye on where it's going, but I'm hopeful that in the recent months, we will get some other good case law in circuits that, they may not necessarily want to win in, or that they, someone else brings a case that also, also comes up with case law that can counter some of the things that we're seeing in these, very conservative circuits. And so everything is really in flux. And so some of the advice we've been giving clients is, one, don't be so quick to over comply. No one has told you to do anything. The EEOC hasn't said to do anything. There is no clear case law saying that any of your DEI programs is illegal. Yes, there is more litigation risk, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to change anything. The other one is kind of changing your mindset in the way you're thinking about things and the way you talk. A lot of the cases we've seen, even before the Supreme Court case, they cite to, some executive or some, other C-suite member saying that, we want to make sure that we hire, that the next general counsel is a Black woman. We don't want you saying that. That's not going to be good if there's litigation. And so be sure that messaging is actually in line with what you're doing. A lot of what you're doing is legal, but the messaging and people maybe down the line may not necessarily understand that. If you have a representational goal for your managers, do they understand, and are you giving them information that says, yes, we have a representational goal of increasing diversity in our workforce, but that means that whenever you're making a hiring decision, you should never hire someone based on race. Are you giving them that same messaging whenever you're giving them this messaging of, these representational goals? I will say, I like to be a realist. I do think in the last 3 years, people have been really committed. And some of the things you said, people have said and companies have done have not necessarily been things that their legal department have given them the thumbs up. And so it's like, let's have that conversation. There's a lot of firms like ours that are doing these litigation audits of telling people, here's where your weak spots are. Again, we're not telling you to change anything, but think about, is there ways, and sometimes they're not even working. Are you getting real value in that? Or is that something that you've just said that you want to do and you haven't actually, follow through? And so that's kind of, the advice that we're giving companies.
That is so powerful. I think we see the same thing in our work. And I think the opportunity to have that careful balance, right, of how do you create enough measurable goals, right, that are going to help you get to progress without creating an environment that is in and out, right, where you've got the door open, but you're also having people run right back out the door because you haven't done the education among your leaders, among your managers, such that they understand what's the rationale for the goal. How do we effectively go about recruiting, whether that's recruiting talent or recruiting vendors into the supply chain, recruiting community partners. Without intentionality, nothing is going to work, whether it's in DEI or it's in any other part of the business. I do wonder, and this is for any of you, what's the slippery slope, right? So how do we go about making sure that we're undoing the harm that maybe some of the efforts have caused without losing the intentional partnerships, right? The depth of, I think we've opened up some solidarity amongst employers and their employees of color, with universities and their students of color over the last 3 years, with some intentional efforts. And so how do employers and universities go about perhaps doing some of the adjustments that you're talking about without taking steps backwards in the places where they've improved? Do you all have thoughts?
I mean, I think from what we've seen, a lot of the areas that they have improved have been these areas that have been low risk. And
Okay.
so sometimes it's not necessarily, so a lot of the risky is where companies were tying. Now, again, there's nothing saying that this is impermissible, but companies were tying executive compensation to reaching representational goals. All companies, McDonald's came out with it, Starbucks came out with it. We're saying that our executives aren't going to get their bonuses if they're not meeting these goals. That was great. But some of that worked, some of that didn't. And that's where the risk might be, but that's not necessarily where the real value is in retaining their talent, in making sure that people actually feel better about their jobs. And that's not where they should really be focusing on. The other thing is, there is, again, like I said, the reputational risk in addition to the litigation risk. And so for some of the clients who have been more willing to really stay committed to their goals, they've said, we understand this is high risk based on the current legal, framework that people are working under, but we care about this and we don't necessarily want our employers thinking we're taking a step back, like you said,
Yeah.
Tawanna. We don't want them thinking that. We don't want to lose their trust. It's taken us a while to gain their trust and we want to keep it. And if that means that someone's going to sue us, then fine, they can sue us. We have the money to defend it. And so there is that. And I think, a company getting sued, like Fearless Fund, I think there is some upside and everyone now knows your name and understands what you stand for. And so a lot of companies aren't willing to take some litigation risk to make sure that their reputation stays intact.
Absolutely. That's really insightful.
Agree. Thomas, I saw you unmute first. You want to jump in on that one?
Sure. So one of the things I think to make sure that our partners don't feel that we're taking a step back is to constantly engage our partners in conversations like this so they understand what we're doing in our organizations. And they understand the why behind what we're doing, and that we're being transparent and where we can, collaborate on data and collaborate on strategies, so they know that we are still pushing and pressing forward. Is one way. It was something that that Amron said, and that you kind of mentioned, that there are a lot of organizations that have taken step backs, because I think in the wake of George Floyd, or right after his death, a lot of organizations saw other organizations pulling up seats to the table and saying that we're going to do this. And a lot of organizations had good intentions of doing things, but didn't understand the work that was involved and did not follow through with putting the resources there in order to do it. And so that's where we also have to show our partners that we not only invested and put the resources there, but we're continuing to measure and monitor and make improvements.
That is perfect. I wish I could, the check is in the mail, because that's exactly where I was going to go. So now I get to say, from industry into the university environment, Our Vice President of Equity and Diversity, Dr. Mercedes Ramirez Fernandez, said it perfectly this summer. You do have to consider the risk of litigation. Here, even in the university environment where we fight for academic freedom, you do also have to be very careful about considering what is the work that we are doing and what is the driving purpose behind the work. And the way she phrased it was that we will continue doing this good work, and we who do the work of diversity and inclusion have always been creative. We have always had to find ways to accomplish the goal. And so now, in conjunction with our legal advisors here at the university and our deans at the college level, school level, like where I am, we just have to think carefully and strategically about what are we thinking about? Are we thinking about a program, an event, an initiative? Who are we targeting? Can we say that we're targeting, this event is open to everybody, or this program is for everybody, and it will center the experiences of a particular group, right? Or, it's a women's leadership conference. So we know that's going to draw some attention because somebody is going to say, but what about men? And then we will say, men are welcome. Come, join us. Learn about the experience of women in leadership and women's leadership development, because that's what this is about. So we're still being inclusive, still doing the work of inclusion, and digging in even deeper to do the next right thing. That's the first level. I think, Tawanna, you were mentioning, the work that we've just started the last few years. That's the first level. It does get harder, it does get more challenging. The next level then is you start looking at and thinking about scholarships and those representational goals and faculty and student body. But we continue to do the work, and we make sure to put the values and the mission first and get ready, just analyze the risk.
Absolutely. I think to that risk point, that analysis that's required, one of the questions that's coming from our audience is about, can we talk a little bit about how we get past the zero-sum game, and recognizing that a lot of this opposition that we're facing in this emboldened climate of racism is really about a zero-sum game. People who sometimes are just determined to be oppositional, but sometimes want to believe, want to get on board, but truly just cannot see the pie getting any bigger, and have said, you know what, I would love for your child to get access, but not if it means my child cannot. I would love for you to get a contract with that company, but not if it means that my contract gets smaller. Love for you to get a promotion, but not if it means that I cannot stay in my job. How do you all consider making that pie get bigger, helping people who cannot see any ways around the zero-sum game? How are you going about convincing them to see otherwise? And how do we do that not just at the individual level, but perhaps at scale? Jean, I think you stumped us.
Well, I answered in the Q&A box too that it burdens my heart to see folks respond from fear rather than curiosity. There's a really cute video. I didn't watch the whole series or the episodes, but there's this show called Ted Lasso where I saw this little video clip of the guy Ted Lasso getting challenged to play a dart game. And it's assumed that he's some sort of bumpkin that's not going to be good at this, and they're just going to really roll over him. And so he just plays the whole aw shucks thing, and then he kind of explains, as he is destroying his competition, hitting bullseye after bullseye, it would have been valuable for the people who underestimated me in the past, and for you who have underestimated me now, to have been curious about me instead. So he teaches a painful and expensive lesson in that moment. And it's funny and it's cute to watch. And I love to use that example because so many people have seen it. But to me, it preaches a sermon, because as you were setting up the question, Tawanna, I was thinking about the experiences I've had in my own life where people did actually position themselves in a place of, I am personally threatened by your success. If you have an opportunity, it is taking something away from me. And I've had the opportunity, the privilege to actually question that with people and be in conversation with people and gently with a smile ask them, what do you lose if if this student gets an opportunity? What do you lose? Are you competing for, at Amran's law firm, are you competing for the same job? And when they acknowledge, and these have been some hard conversations, when they acknowledge that actually, no, I don't have a law degree, right? Or my son doesn't have a law degree, but I want him to get this job as an associate. But this person who has 4 degrees and 30 years of experience, and they just happen to be Black, you're suggesting that they're only getting the job because they're Black. I'm going to let you sit with that. You're going to need to work through that. You know, I do try not to be impertinent and to only ask pertinent questions and to invite people into the change space. But what we've got to come through is that fear response, that fear reaction. I had somebody here in the Twin Cities complain to me about the challenge of being told to hire people who were obviously not qualified for work in their organization, but to hire them just on the strength of affinity. And they were challenged with trying to improve the representational diversity in their organization. And as the only woman in their organization, they were being challenged, they were being met with a lot of pushback. We have diversity, we have you. Now go ahead and hire this person who is clearly not qualified. So we're expanding the systemic bias in this particular organization. It can be a lot. It can be a whole lot. We just have to keep pushing and take care of ourselves on the journey so we can keep leading the conversations gently and asking the pertinent questions and inviting people into the change space. And for those who are adamant that it is a zero-sum game and they choose to hold on to their fear, sometimes we have to let them stay where they are and move on without them until they get in the parade.
And I'll just jump in. You know, I totally agree with Angela. And when you asked the question, I was really thinking and trying to form in my head how I was going to say this, but I'll just say it because you just said it, Angela. Sometimes you have to leave those people where they are because you know that you're not going to 100% get everyone to get past the zero-sum game. But for those that have an open mind and are willing, you know, there's something that we do in healthcare a lot. Whenever we get ready to initiate a change in process, a change in service, introduce something new, we always like to take our constituents back to a patient story, because it brings them back to the why we do certain things. And so in this instance, I think it is very important for the organizations that are embracing diversity and showing that it is working, because you're starting to see higher profit margins. You're starting to see growth within your organization. You're starting to see more innovative ideas come to fruition. If we tell those stories to the people that are sitting at the spot of the zero-sum game, there's going to be some conversion there. We're going to get some people over that hump. But there are some people that are going to stay there. And for those people, unfortunately, we have to allow them to stay there and work on the people that we know have the open mind that we could possibly get them past. This is a zero-sum game. And if you win, I can't win. We can all win. And so for those people that support that idea, tell the why and get them there.
That is the perfect close for us. Thank you so much. We can all win. We're going to leave people there who cannot get there, but that is absolutely right. We can all win. And that is the perfect way for us to wrap. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists. Help me give it up for them. All of you who are in the audience, a big thank you to our audience as well. Ms. Shevlin, we are going to get your question over directly to Amran so that we can get an answer over to you for that specific question that is in the chat. I want to say a huge thank you to you all for dedicating time and talent and expertise to today's conversation. You've been absolutely phenomenal. And I'm more than grateful, not only for that, but for the work that you're doing in our communities and your institutions every single day to drive equity and inclusion, and specifically racial equity and inclusion and inclusive economic growth. You are change makers and bold ones at that. And I'm grateful to be in solidarity with you on the journey. I also want to say thank you to you all as our audience and for your partnership and being participants on today. We cannot do this work without you. And so we're particularly grateful for each one of you. I want to encourage you to not only participate on today, but to continue to participate in this journey with us for the Powering Inclusion series all throughout this fall. We're not done. In just about a month, we will be back with you for a housing workshop where we'll be talking more deeply about housing affordability and inclusivity and tools that employers can use to be able to continue to drive inclusive and equitable growth in housing for both your employees and residents throughout our communities. We just had a win here in St. Paul, so you don't want to miss that. I also want to encourage you to take advantage of our survey on today so that you can give us feedback about what you appreciated today, other topics that you want to be sure that you take advantage of and are able to benefit from. We want to be sure that you know about our full team. I think there's a slide the team may have already showed. Maybe I can't see it, that represents our full team as well here at the Center for Economic Inclusion. All 30 of these amazing people do such phenomenal work every single day, and they are the power behind the Center for Economic Inclusion. And I'm so proud to be able to work with every one of them, as well as want to give it up for our tech and AV team today, who is driving such excellent work. Really grateful for all of them and for all of you. And we will be sure that we see you at our very next Powering Inclusion Summit in October, and for our forum in November. Check out our website in order to get that information, and be sure that as this series comes out on YouTube that you share the link so that people who were not here with us today can benefit from it as well. Thanks so much and take care, everybody. Bye-bye.